Hi, I'm Peter Coronius from the Cybersecurity Advisors Network, and we're here tonight with a special panel where we'll be discussing cyber fatigue. With us tonight, we have three very special guests who are all experts in their respective fields. So our first panelist, and he'll be leading off the discussion, is cyber behaviour expert and researcher Andrew Reeves from the University of Adelaide. Welcome, Andrew. And then we've got recently published author Lisa Sisson, who has published a book called Risk Begins and Ends with People, or is it Starts and Ends? Starts and Ends, okay. And then last but not least, Soren Thoma, who is I would say, Soren, I like to think of you as a cyber governance expert, although I know you've worn many hats. So I think that's a nice combination then, because we've got the research that Andrew's going to be talking about. We've got the people aspect that Lisa can expand on, maybe with reference to some of the observations from your book. And then we've got Soren coming in and giving us the governance implications and any other observations that you think relate to the topic. With that brief introduction, I'd like to welcome Andrew. I guess the best place to start is, what's the research telling us now about cyber fatigue? Because that is really your area. So.
Yes, well, thank you for that introduction, Peter. It's great to be here. So for those of you that don't know me, I'm a researcher at the University of Adelaide, and my whole area of research is on the human aspects of cybersecurity, as you can imagine, but specifically we didn't end up intending to go down this route, but we ended up focusing on cybersecurity fatigue. And the reason that sort of came up for us is we ran a study back in 2017 that was looking at people's risk perceptions around security and whether that influenced their behavior and sort of how it influenced their behavior. And as part of that, we ended up measuring people on a whole bunch of things. And one of the things we measured was their how frequently they received training and advice and things like that around security at their work. And we didn't really expect much to come from that. But that ended up actually being one of the biggest predictors of cyber risk behavior, but it was negative. So we found that the people who had more frequent cybersecurity training at work were actually exhibiting poorer behavior. Now, at first, we didn't really think too much of that. So I believe we thought the most likely thing that was happening there was maybe a bit of a complacency effect. So maybe people are being trained a lot, so they feel like they get they know what they're doing, so they're invulnerable. But that explanation didn't really always sit right. And then we thought maybe there's like a third variable effect there where it's just the people who need the most training are getting the most training and therefore it's not actually causal. So we did a couple of studies around that, but that wasn't really what was happening. And then it wasn't until like a year later that we actually thought, well, actually it could be fatigue. It could be that people who are being trained more frequently, who are hearing about cybersecurity more often, are actually getting sick of hearing about it. Maybe some of us here can even relate to that. In a previous life, I used to work as in IT, just in like support and development. And so I do relate to that feeling of being constantly battered around the head with security recommendations. And after a while, you do start to switch off a little bit. So we thought maybe that's what's going on. And we decided that that's where we'd focus our research. It was right at the time when I was beginning my PhD. So we thought, yep, that's the one. Let's focus on that. And, like academics like doing, we had to come up with a definition of it. So we came up with a definition of cybersecurity fatigue, which I'm sure you would have seen. It was on the link that Peter sent out. Like all writers, I guess you look back at something you've written a few years ago and you go, "Oh, I'm not sure I love that," but it was useful at the time. And I think one of the big things about cybersecurity fatigue is, it really does differ depending on the sort of the people you're talking about. So my background is more towards the end, what you might call the end user. So the average day-to-day employee whose role isn't specifically to do with cybersecurity, but nevertheless, they have an impact on cybersecurity. As we all know, it can be almost any employee that can unwittingly enable an attack. And a lot of those people, I did a bit of a search earlier to try to come up with the latest percentage, but around 20% of people in the studies that I've done indicate that they're experiencing some level of cyber fatigue. So it's about 1 in 5. It's by no means the majority, but it doesn't need to be. It only needs to be a couple of people to enable an attack, and suddenly it's a big problem. And these are people who they're not complacent. So they're not people who have just never cared. They're people who did care at some point and really do understand the value of cybersecurity, but have lost that motivation over time, either because they feel it's too difficult to keep up with the latest advice, or they think the actions they have to complete at work are just too complicated and it just is very tiring for them to do it. And so over time, their level of interest has dropped. So if we're talking about 1 in 5 people relating to that, that's a pretty high percentage. So that's for the end user. The other side of it is we could look at people who actually do have a cybersecurity function in their role. So people like who operate as CISOs, people who operate in a C-suite. These people as well will probably relate to feeling tired of hearing about cybersecurity over and over again. And there was a great paper from, I think it was IBM, where they interviewed and studied a bunch of such professionals. And it was around 40% of them were saying that, yeah, we're kind of sick of hearing about cybersecurity, to the extent that they actually stopped proactively defending themselves. They would respond to incidents as they would happen, but they were burnt out and they didn't want to do anything above that. They'd say, well, we'll just do what we need to do to get by. So I think that's hopefully highlights how prevalent the issue is. And the reason it's such a problem is that cybersecurity by its nature is constantly changing. As we can defend against attacks that we're familiar with, and to some extent we can preempt attacks, but just due to the nature of this being a two-way thing where there are bad guys, if you want to call them that, trying to attack and we are trying to defend, it means every time we do something to defend ourselves, the attacker will change their method of operating. And so for that reason, the advice we give people is going to be constantly changing. And if people are disconnecting and they're feeling fatigued and they're sick of hearing about it, then they're not going to be listening to the next thing we say. And so they're going to be stuck doing behavior that was maybe best practice 5 years ago, but isn't anymore. And that's also part of the problem, because when we ran a study a couple of years ago, we tried to look at what does cyber fatigue actually look like in normal day-to-day employees. And one of the things you hear is that they're sick of the advice changing. You told us to do one thing 2 years ago, now you're telling us to do something completely different now. It's an unfortunate almost nature of the beast that it is going to keep changing, and we need to sort of work out a way that we can keep up to date while also empathizing with people and say, yeah, we know it's actually quite annoying that we have to keep telling you to do something different, but unfortunately it's the nature of the beast. So that's the sort of research lens that I take on this issue. It's very human specific. My background is in psychology in particular, so I do take that lens. I'm aware I'm probably waffling on, so maybe I can. What would you want me to?
Oh, that's great, Andrew. I mean, this is what we wanted to start with, was just some hard sort of evidence coming out of the research on this is not just a perceptual problem, but there's actually validity to the point where it becomes systemic, as a systemic problem that is endangering organizations. And I thought, when I first read your research last year, and it's led me to contact you, what shocked me was these findings that giving people too much training can actually start to lead to worse outcomes in their behavioral change. So I think there's a really interesting discussion around, this mantra of awareness training, which is so frequently a part of risk assessment these days and recommendations, sounds to me like it's completely uninformed around what the research is saying. There's a disconnect.
Yeah, and it's a tricky thing, because in a lot of industry standards, there'll be a recommendation to train your employees, and it's certainly a good thing to be doing. But I think sometimes when the training is developed simply because it's almost like a compliance thing. People are aware of that. The people going through the training can sense that what they're being trained in is not really to change their behavior. It's just to achieve some compliance requirement, which can get people offside immediately. If they get that sense in the first 5 minutes, even if sometimes it's not actually true, sometimes the training is actually there to change their behavior and comes from a good place. But if they get the sense that it's just for compliance reasons, they're going to switch off before they've even started. And the problem with any type of fatigue like this is it's sticky. Once they've got it in their head that cybersecurity is this pain that they have to deal with, and occasionally they have to do this training, it's hard to get people out of that mindset.
That's probably a good point to bring Lisa in now to the discussion. So Lisa, in your book, Risk Starts and Ends with People, you also identified fatigue as one of the factors, the risk factors to be managed. What's your response hearing what Andrew said that the research is showing? I mean, is that according with what you're seeing effectively on the ground when you talk to organizations?
I think it is very reflective of some of the challenges that are going on. I mean, even just outside of cyber, there's some major issues in regards to just lack of engagement and disengagement with employees overall. But specifically in an environment where, like cyber, as you and I have talked about, Peter, these people are going and doing battle day in, day out. They don't get to disconnect the same way some other roles get that opportunity to. And so not only are they in a role where there's that pressure, if something goes wrong, they're sort of exposed. They're certainly not always patted on the back. It's not one of those roles that every time they stop something that someone comes and says, hey, great job, everybody. So it's really always on the weighted side that they're feeling the pressure that's always being upon them. And especially because the motivation, as you mentioned, Andrew, of the attackers, they are motivated. They're smart. They use technologies. They're weaponizing things that they're really keen to break down barriers. And it's part of, on the flip side, then the people who are having to defend day in, day out and having to do this tick box approach to their training constantly because there is a new flavor that does feel very dry, that it's actually being geared towards talking at them, then, it just wears people down. And you go look at people through the behavior, who they are people. They have lives. They're in there trying to do the best they can. They're trying to utilize the tools in the best way that they can. But we can't lose sight that they are people. And so we've got to make sure that they're looking after their well-being and also trying to get away from that reactive approach to everything. It's trying to encourage people at the table to when there is a shift and there's things happening, to keep them motivated. How can they be participating and looking at things a different way? How can the training start changing the mindset and getting into what kind of things can we consider? How can we explore the opportunity that's within the risk, because we know there is opportunity in there, but sometimes just with the pressures, the lack of resources, which we've talked about a number of times, that there's so many of the team are now having to do roles of themselves and potentially one or two others because we have a shortfall. So all these layers and these challenges don't make it a great place for the people within the cybersecurity realm to be doing work. And I also do believe that a lot of them feel like they're in this isolated bubble and unappreciated within the business the same way as potentially other departments within, organizations. So there needs to be a real mind shift and start getting back to really what this team is actually doing, what these people are actually doing, how they're actually supporting the business, how they're actually protecting the business in that day-to-day, and start thinking about then how do we look after their well-being, keep them, what's kind of, dragging them down. And definitely we need to start looking at the changing around training. We must look at training being something to work on a mindset, a motivation, a shift that way, an engagement discussion, engaging people to come up with solutions, ideas, and get them feeling like they are really contributing to something versus this talk at them scenario. Because yeah, tick boxes, you know, within the whole risk management strategy have certainly done their time, and we're seeing more and more, regardless of what area you're talking about, it's a defendable piece of paper, but it's not actually managing the risk itself. So we need to change the mindset.
That's really good, some powerful observations there. Soren, I'd like to bring you in now. You've obviously been at the compliance end in some of your roles, but also advising on governance. What do you think it would take to start to shift the mindset away from compliance to more of a risk-based and an approach that's more informed by some of the dynamics that we've been discussing here?
Peter, I think we need to start thinking a little bit more outside the box, and I'll explain what I mean by that. To me, fatigue applies on 4 different levels. It applies to the organization, the company, it applies to the workforce, the customers, and the cyber professionals, the cybersecurity team. And there's different aspects to that on each one of those levels. And rather than focusing on the problem, because I think we understand and we've defined the problem reasonably well, I'd like to think more positively about some of the things that I've seen that actually work. So, for example, in the cybersecurity team, often achievement is not recognized and it's not celebrated. An investment bank that wins $100 million deal, they'll be drunk for a week, you know, partying around town. A cybersecurity professional that saves $100 million probably goes home quietly and has a cup of coffee and goes to bed early. So there's a big difference there. I think that is a huge mistake. And one of the things that is very important, I think, is to celebrate success. And I know sometimes we can't publish the details because we don't want to brag about it and we don't want to attract unwanted attention. But within an organization, I think we need to celebrate success. Another thing that really upsets me and bothers me is how much badly implemented technology resulting in false positives and in false alerts and overloading the cybersecurity team, that has such a major negative impact. For example, GRC, governance, risk and compliance, which includes cybersecurity as a dashboard, if you wind it up too tightly with too many specific rules, you will get many thousands of false positives. And this is where culture comes in. So if you're going to, say, a country in Asia, perhaps Singapore, where they want more details and they want to look at things and they wind things up too tightly, then you have to explain to the executives that you're probably wasting millions of dollars looking at things that are never going to happen. So culturally, I think that contributes to fatigue. And if we actually apply a principle of less is more, or keep it a little bit simpler, avoid unnecessary complexity, I think that will be extremely valuable. Another aspect of that is that perhaps us as cyber professionals, sometimes we make things complicated, and we should perhaps understand usability a little bit better. How do we make things simple and yet still effective? Example, I think MFAs very badly implemented it many times to the point where it becomes useless because people don't understand it, and yet we rely on it. So, you know, when it comes to training, I like to make training, and I've experimented with this at University of New South Wales, where we developed a video game called Alice. So people would actually go through the 10 stages within the video game and learn how to put in strong passwords. And they had this character called Alice helping them. And then at the very end, they discover that Alice is actually the protagonist and it's stolen their identity. And the shock of that. But if you make it fun, if you make it sort of, you try to break out the spiral, because we all know the nature of cybersecurity is with us forever. There's no beginning and no end. So you can start feeling like being under siege and going to a downward spiral. And then it's really difficult to break from that spiral. And so a video game or a celebration, or one of my other favorite methods, is to rotate people through the business. So give people planned regular timeouts. And then the business gets to see the cybersecurity professional and see, oh, you're a real person just like us, and you're actually trying to help us. And doing that rotation gets better engagement and better collaboration. Now, none of these techniques are silver bullets, but they all can have an impact. And one of the things that concerns me the most at the moment is because a lot of people are working from home, they're isolated. I think developing the wrong mentality and the wrong attitude can take you down a path where mental health suffers and people just are not, their well-being is at risk because they're out there on their own and they're not participating as much as part of a community.
I'm glad that you brought up the mental health aspect, Soren. It's obviously it's something I think you guys know is a bit of a fixation with me, not just with the employees, but particularly the cyber professionals. I feel that are and in fact, there's this sort of vicious circle, isn't there, that the more fatigued the end user is and the more prone to mistakes they are, that just increases the burden on the protectors in the organization, who then become more fatigued, and you end up in this terrible sort of bind. But I'm also appreciate the fact you did think through some positive suggestions around this idea of decomplexifying what we do, making it fun, talking about engagement. Andrew, I just want to circle back to you. One thing that your research also points to is something that I felt intuitively for a long time, but you've actually been able to, if not quantify it, at least qualify it. And that is this question of the different motivations that trigger people's engagement. Do you want to just talk to us a little bit about that? Because I know that's one of the key things that we both agree has been a bit of a roadblock here, is that we're treating everyone as if they have the same motivational factors and orienting training around that one thing. What do you say to that as a problem?
Yeah, I think it's a very relevant point you bring up. It's something that, so my particular field of work, I guess you could say, is organizational psychology, and it's really the study of people at work. And so there's been a lot of research that does look into what are the things that actually motivate people. And one of the things that a particular organizational psychologist that I used to work with used to say quite often was that, because you get people coming to you and they say, I can't motivate my staff to do this, or my staff just aren't motivated. How do I get them motivated? And he would say, people are motivated all of the time. What's different is what they're motivated to do. So if you look at someone and you say, I can't seem to motivate them to do this particular behavior that I think is best in the workplace, or if I can't motivate them to take security seriously, I'd challenge that and say, well, it's not that they're not motivated to do those things. It's they're motivated to do something else. And often what that is will be things that are job performance related criteria. So we often hear that security feels like it's something that gets in the way. So if you talk to web development staff, they have deadlines they're meant to achieve. They're meant to have a product out and running at a certain point in time. And if they have to keep adding extra levels of complexity to what they're building just to meet a security requirement, often that's the first thing to go, because they would rather get a product out and working than worry about a risk that may not even happen. So that's the first thing to say, is that often it's, when we look at motivation, we should think, well, what is actually motivating these people? So if the other way we can look at it is to think, well, yes, as you said, people are motivated by different things. So some people will be motivated by, and it's a relatively small percentage, but some people will be motivated by simply doing what their manager says they should do. Other people are motivated by a desire to get on and make money, all the rest of it. Some people are motivated by being acknowledged for their achievements. And to be honest, everyone is a little bit motivated by all of those things. And you can measure people on them. You can get an idea of whether you're super motivated by that or not particularly motivated by that. Some people will be very motivated by money and not so much motivated by being, by building networks with others or something like that. Whereas other people will be the complete opposite. They'll be quite happy in a job that just pays as much as they need, but what they want from their job is just feeling like they've made a real connection with the people around them. So if you can form an understanding of what are the motivators in your team, and are we aligning security to those things? So at the moment, if you take people to a training program and they're simply told to do a couple of things, that's not really aligned to many people's motivators. But if security is in their, if it's in their performance evaluation in some respect, well, then you're going to be motivating certain people that want to do well on those things. If you have a culture where your management are constantly acknowledging and saying, great job, I can see that you maybe even took a bit longer on that project, but you did it because you needed to meet some security standard. Well done, I'm glad you did that. Well, then you're going to be motivating the people who want to build that network in the office. So I think it's one of these fields where there's actually been a lot of research on motivators for people, but it just hasn't made that step to security yet.
Yeah, I think that I mean, the training that I've seen, which is not necessarily exhaustive, but it does strike me that there's never been enough options that recognize the fact that people are coming from different places. And so, Lisa, when we talked about risk recently on your podcast, I had raised with you this idea of, and this is something Andrew's comes out very strongly in Andrew's research about flipping into different parts of your brain when you're fatigued and when you're stressed. What else can you say about that, just in terms of how people respond to pressures in the workplace that might have a bearing on risk that we could possibly pre-identify and maybe divert?
Yeah, and I guess the interesting thing when you talk about people, people are fascinating, right? And we're very different in the way that we interpret the world and information and different things, because we've all had a different journey in life. We talk about our predisposition, our values, all the things that we've built up over time. And so we're gonna get access to the same kind of information, but it's going to mean different things to us. And I was listening to what you were saying, Andrew, around the whole thing around, people sort of being motivated in a way that they want to protect. It's going to come back to people's predisposition and how they feel they're kind of connecting to the purpose, to the mission, to the values of the company. All these little things are going to make such a huge difference based on that. And what's going to end up really driving them to want to engage, to get creative, to do things. Because I know when we've talked about, the whole brain thing and being overwhelmed, we talk about it in a way that we look at so we focus around the whole risk of a person, and then look at risk to a person and risk by a person in our system. And then we actually look at what makes up what we call a risk cocktail. So that's looking at their predisposition and how stresses can affect them, and then looking at things like triggers, because everyone's different. Like, you can't look at someone and gauge necessarily what's going to trigger them. Some people don't even know the types of things that will change an onset and how things are going to affect them. Some people are quite self-aware and are more familiar, but a lot of people aren't. So when you're looking at an environment, if you're going in and you're doing training that's just one flavor, or you're doing any kind of management or approach that's just one flavor, you're going to be missing probably a percentage of your audience just because of the way that we interpret things differently. And I think one of the things that I try and encourage people to think about doing is that when you get to know your people, is try and look at the environment of the risk to the employees. So we don't start adding more and more stress when they're already stressed. That can end up being, the last straw that broke the camel's back, so to speak, that can trigger them to be overwhelmed, that they can't cope with the things. They're making poor decisions, taking poor actions. And we need to be mindful of this, because within the workplace, people are making decisions and taking actions every day. They're either going to provide value and opportunities to an organization, or potentially risk. And so it's really, if we just kind of keep dismissing and thinking that they're okay, or that it's just one way, then we're not really understanding our own sort of risk dynamics. So I think it's something that needs to be looked at more, and back to what you're referring, Peter, is looking at the individual people and how things are going to affect them specifically, and how they're going to react.
I'm on mute. I like the fact that you reflected back on what Andrew said. And I just want to finally come back to Soren, and then I think we're going to open it up for some questions and interaction with our participants, because I can feel like people are burning to say something or to share. This is such a compelling subject because it is so timely and so relevant. But Soren, just on this thing of engaging individuals. How, in practice, how would you start, you know, reinventing an organization? You talked about culture. You know, what does it take? Where does the leadership have to come from? And how does the message need to be articulated to get some of this change?
Very, very good question, Peter. Look, the most difficult thing to change is culture and people. And yet at the same time, when I look at it, the most valuable aspect of any business is the culture and the people. And, you know, sometimes I like to do this exercise. If I had a magic wand, what would I do that, you know, to actually fix things and to make things better? And one of the things that I think about, and this is not new, it's been tried and it's been proven that it works, is when the leadership comes down to the front line and they experience what's happening on the front line, even if it's only for 2 to 3 to 4 hours or half a day, they get a better understanding and they're in a much better position to make decisions. One of the things that I like to do whenever I'm leading a team, and I've led some really big teams where it stretches me because there were hundreds of people, I like to walk the floors and talk to people. I like to find out what the mood is and how people, what motivates people, because there's no one person is the same as another. Different people have different motivation, different attitudes, different aptitudes. And sometimes I even wonder whether we should test some people, because some people thrive on a challenge and can deal with a bit more stress than others can. And perhaps it's those people that we should have in cybersecurity. And another aspect of my magic wand is I would actually get anyone who has any aspirations of leadership, management, and even cybersecurity, or works in a team, to actually study some units of psychology at university. I think that is just a basic, because we're all human and we have to interact with each other. And ultimately, the human error and fatigue are probably one of the major contributors to incidents and vulnerabilities and mistakes. And so it's worth focusing on the people aspect. Look, there is no magic one thing silver bullet. Ultimately, I also think cybersecurity somewhere when God handed out professions, drew a short straw. And what I mean by that is cybersecurity tends to always be under-resourced because it's invisible. The actual success of it is invisible. So I give you an example. A multi-billion-dollar company, the board of directors, who were also directors in a bank, was horrified to find out how little they were spending on cybersecurity and allocated $50 million. And external consultants said that at least $10 million a year was needed, and the chief financial officer only allocated $2 million. So you can see there that it's not just a little bit less, it's an order of magnitude, 5 orders of magnitude. And I'm finding that to be consistent, where I don't know of very many cybersecurity shops that are very well funded and very well looked after. And so if you're doing 2 or 3 jobs, of course you're going to get tired a lot quicker. If you're not appreciated and no one tells you that you're doing a good job, of course you're going to feel different about your job. So it comes back to the basics: looking after people, supporting people, and literally building teams. And as much as I hate to say it, there's too many instances where teams do not work well together. The turnover is high. And so that's the impact of it. Right.
Actually, as you were saying that, Soren, I was thinking about these recent statistics about the Great Resignation and the 24% of people that are going to change jobs in the next year. And I'm sort of wondering in my mind, I wonder if cyber fatigue is actually one of the contributors. It wouldn't be the only one, but I bet you that a certain portion of that 24% would be getting tipped over the edge, in part because of the increasing demands of working from home and all these additional protections that we're asking them to do. And it's all too hard, and they just want to, the easiest thing is just to change a job. So we'll see. But look, this has been a fantastic discussion so far. And so I'm inviting now anyone from the audience, the virtual participants, to speak up. I think you can turn your video on and say who you are and ask a question and address it to anyone in the panel or on the panel or anyone generally? So who have we got that's ready for a little bit of a discussion?
I'll put my hand up and ask a question if I could.
Yeah, Andrew.
Yeah, cool. I think it was Lisa, was her background in psych?
No, Andrew.
Oh, Andrew's got the background in psych, sorry. Yeah, my question would look at or I'd be interested in if there's, or what the literature says around different personalities and their affinity for change or not. You know, I know some people are conservative or have a conservative kind of outlook on things, and how does that fit within messages that's changing, or I guess the constant change that's embedded in like the cybersecurity reality? So how do we talk to that?
Yeah, I think that's a very, very good question. So within the, we always talk about the Big Five model of personality. Sitting underneath that is the 16-factor model, which is a more detailed look at personality, and then those things collapse into what we call the Big Five. When we talk about behavior at work, we tend not to look at the Big Five and we look at the 16 just because we have more detail, and sometimes sub-factors conflict with each other. And there's one in there that we tend to informally call change orientation, which is exactly what you're talking about. It's the level that, some people love having something new every day, and other people really want routine and structure and predictability. And there's no good or bad as to which side you sit on. It's just everyone sits along that spectrum somewhere. And then some people are right down the middle, and some days they want one and some days they want the other. So that's one factor of it. And I think for the people that are up the more change-oriented side, I haven't seen any direct research that's supported this, but you could make the argument that they would be more willing to keep up to date, as it were. They don't mind the changing space as much. That said,
a stamina metric, perhaps.
Yeah, well,
maybe something.
Yeah, and I was going to say, there are other relevant dimensions on personality as well, and one of them is what they call informality, which is not a particularly descriptive title, but it essentially means the extent to which you like having a lot of control over your day-to-day work, particularly at work. So someone could be really change-oriented, but they want to be the driver of that change. They want to be setting the agenda and saying, this is what's coming next, and let's do this and that. For them, they'll be really change-oriented, but maybe they don't like security much because it's not really driven by them. They're being told what to do on a day-to-day basis. Whereas other people will be very change-oriented and quite happy to be sort of told what's happening, and they'll be a bit more able to function. And I think we have to be careful not to get into the trap of thinking, well, maybe we should hire only those sort of people for security. It can be very difficult to say with any confidence who is going to be good or bad at any particular role. I think what can be more valuable, though, is if we give feedback to people. So if you are sitting more down you're not as change oriented and you don't really like being told what to do, if we can have often literally a one-on-one feedback session with that person, saying, these traits you have are going to be super valuable in certain situations, as people down that end tend to be, if they don't mind routine every day, then that means they're probably going to have a bit more detail orientation on the more repetitive tasks. So there's places of work where that is a super valuable thing to have. But then we'll just say, look, here's these other situations where allowing yourself to be a bit more change-oriented is probably beneficial. And we're not asking you to change your personality, but when those things come up, then maybe you can lean into those sort of behaviors. We often use the analogy of left and right-handedness. We can all write with both hands, but we obviously have an affinity to write with one over the other. Where if you really wanted to, you could write with the other hand and you'll get better at it the more you practice it. And it's the same here as well. You've got an affinity to be change-oriented or not, and it's about knowing when it's best to actually lean into that or lean out of it.
That was a great question, Andrew, and a good answer, Andrew, as well. But not just a good answer, but I had a slight epiphany when you're talking about the 16 factors at the detail level that govern personality, or the different manifestations of personality. And you just talked about the interaction between two of those, change orientation and self-directedness, I think was the other one. Now, I'm thinking of combinations and permutations that exist between all 16 factors, and suddenly it jumps out as clear as day that this is the complexity that we're dealing with when we're talking about individuals, not only just within a workplace, but then you add another dynamic to that, and that is the dynamic nature of cybersecurity. So you've got all these interacting personality traits being recontextualized within a shifting cyber domain.
Yeah.
And I mean, I think to me that was kind of the thing that exemplified why it is that people are feeling fatigued, is because, contrast to what I just said then, the nuances that exist within that analysis. You have training and expectations that are predicated largely on a single behavior type and largely on a static set of messaging that might have been good 5 years ago and is not perhaps flexible enough, or if it is changing, to your earlier point, that it's not communicated well enough that you can carry people forward with that. So I think there's some real power in that, the insights that you derive from that analysis. Let's invite somebody else to ask a question. We've got about a quarter of an hour left. Someone's sitting
I'll
on...
go, Peter, if that's all right.
Go, Corey.
Wonderful. Okay, so open to the entire panel. I'm interested to know, in your guys' experience with addressing boards specifically, but I suppose by extension, just conducting awareness training as well. What would you say have been some successful strategies in conveying technical principles and terms and strategies to non-technical audiences?
Yeah, I'm going to give that to Soren first, but Lisa might want to chime in after that because I know you've done some good senior level communications as well. Soren, have a go first.
All right. So look, quite often I do a lot of advisory work at senior levels and at board level, and I know that they do not understand the acronyms, so I have to be extremely careful that I explain things in simple terms. I find that what works best is stories and parallel analogies, and people respond to those and you get their attention very quickly. And you've also got to realize that you don't have a long time to get someone's attention. If you lose them within 30, 60 seconds, that's it, you've lost them. So the best way I can illustrate that for you is to give you an example. I was asked to evaluate a proposal. The board wanted to invest $50 million into a SIEM, a security incident event management system. And they had no idea what a SIEM was. And I knew that I couldn't explain it to them in a technical sort of a way. So I used an analogy of a city with the traffic going down the streets. And literally what a SIEM would do is take a snapshot and store the traffic going down the streets and look for anomalies. And that helped people understand very quickly what it was. And then I was able to explain the advantages and disadvantages, and they could make a decision that was far more informed and also give them the alternatives. But one of the things that most people don't understand within cybersecurity, this communication problem, there's a major communication barrier, because I'm guilty as this more than most. It is so easy to slip back into what you know and use all the acronyms and all the terms. And then suddenly you realize that everyone's looking at you funny and they don't know what you're talking about. So I think communication is important. And that's my take. Have I addressed the question?
Excellent. Yeah, most definitely. I largely agree with your observations, especially when it comes to the acronyms. I think you can talk about an IR plan and you can talk about GRC, and you can assume that the audience is going to know exactly what those are. But in many cases, there are going to be at least a few members of that audience that have absolutely no idea what you're talking about. Mm-hmm. But in a group setting, they're probably a little bit afraid or embarrassed maybe to pop their hand up and say, hey, actually, I don't know what that is. But the reality is that everyone else in the room who doesn't understand is going to be super thankful that that person has done that, right? But better not to put them in that position in the first place and just spell out all these concepts in as simple terms as possible. Yeah, so I think generally speaking, people in this industry are very good at talking to each other within the kind of industry itself, InfoSec specifically, but when talking to people outside of that bubble, outside of that industry who don't necessarily speak the same language, I think you're right. There is a disconnect. There is a communication barrier.
And I think it's about the audience. You're absolutely right. It's the target audience. So if you're talking to directors and legal people talking about risk and commercials and putting it in those terms, they always understand it because, you know, that's their bread and butter. And so if you target the audience with the appropriate analogy, they will understand you.
Yeah, good. That's good, Soren. And Lisa, you've had a fair bit to do with senior leadership and advisory work.
Yeah.
How would you pick up Corey's point on just communication?
Yeah, well, there's a few things that I'd probably pick up. So I definitely agree. Common language, simplifying is really, really important. And ask yourself the question when you're going in to brief the board, are you going in there to usually impress, or are you going in there to educate and share a message? And so I think sometimes one of the things that I've observed and had conversations with other people is that when they're kind of going in and have this opportunity to present the board, what is it they're actually trying to achieve? And again, even when you go in and are targeting whether it's a project, talking about technology, something in relation to that area. The other thing that I might mention here that we talk quite a bit around is the potential of conflict in relation to some of the projects that are being presented or the language that is being used versus the actual identity of the business, what their values and everything are. It's something that's come up more and more, is that we're often seeing, especially from like a risk management standpoint, that there can actually be conflict in the way they're approaching risk management compared to what their identity and what they talk about. And that's sometimes where there's this also disconnect around people trying to really sort of see the value in what their role is, because it's kind of being told one thing and feeling like it's another. And this goes back to some things that even Soren said around the technologies and the overheads that you've got and all these other things. So I think when you go in and you know, talk with the board, it's around giving the clarity that they need. So you're right, simple language, simple messaging. What is the objective? How's it sort of been briefed? And never make assumptions and never feel like it's a conversation. I always say not to impress, it's one to educate, it's one to connect them to the value of what it is that you're trying to present to them.
Good. Very
phenomenally helpful. Thank you guys so much. That's
very practical. Good question and good answers. So is there anyone on the call that's not actually actively engaged in cybersecurity at the moment, but maybe more of a user perspective that might want to chime in, just in terms of what your perceptions might be, or if not, at least your work with users, that you could give us a user perspective on this whole conundrum? Who would like to have a go at that? Saba? Yes?
Yeah, I'm working on cyber area. So yeah, but I had a question from the panel actually about that cyber training program. You know what I was thinking, because when you just start a role at any organization, usually you will be given a contract that you need to protect, that it mentions that you need to protect that highly sensitive data, the sensitive data, and then usually you have that kind of onboarding process, so that you need to take some cyber training program if that organization is mature enough, and then some regular updates, regular message, and that's it. And what I was thinking when the panels were discussing about cyber fatigue, I was thinking maybe one solution could be we have that cyber training specifically tailored to job description of everybody. So it means that for cyber training, if we have a team of cyber trainers, so that for each individual, or at least for each group of people with similar responsibilities, they just kind of start thinking about a specific tailored cyber program, it may increase that motivation level so that they feel that it's just tailored for themselves, it's completely understandable for them based on their daily routine. I would like to know what panel think about that a specific way of cyber training.
Andrew, I think that might be a good one for you to try.
Yeah, I think it's a fantastic suggestion, and obviously something that would be awesome if we could get it going. I guess it sort of comes back to Soren's point about budget and how much funding is available. Is very tricky to make training that is specific to individualized job roles. Even, of course, job roles are always changing as well, so it makes it tricky. I think, I'd also almost go further as well to say that if we can have training that is specific to people's preferences in terms of how they learn, in terms of things that they value at work, even in terms of some of their personality characteristics that we've spoken about. That way you don't necessarily need to know everything about the individual who's taking the training, but if you have sort of versions of the training that are, some will work better for certain types of people and some will work better for others, and you just have a spread, you can kind of try to capture as many people as possible. But the other thing I would say is, particularly as we're obviously talking about cybersecurity fatigue, is one of the big questions I think we have to ask ourselves is training even the thing we should be thinking about? Because sometimes training is part of the problem. If people are sick of hearing about cybersecurity, they're sick of even hearing the term, thinking of, from a regular employee perspective, putting them into a training program might make the problem worse, or at least not make it any better. So for them, we probably need a slightly different approach. And maybe it's as simple, similar to what Soren was saying as well. Sometimes the demands that we place on people in order to maintain their cybersecurity are quite, they can be overwhelming. So even something as simple as argument to be made that we should make those things as simple and easy as possible. So we can, rather than trying to increase people's motivation, if we can lower the kind of barriers, make it easier, make it more user-friendly, then we're probably going to achieve some pretty good things there as well. Soren. Oh, it's from Soren, yeah.
Yeah, look, I completely agree with you, Andrew. I think you've brought in an excellent point. One of the things that I like to do is, rather than actually having training for people, is to simulate the incident response plane as a training exercise. And that actually brings people into a real life situation that involves their particular roles, and that comes in. Another thing I like to do is a team building exercise where I actually bring in an external, believe it or not, organizational psychologist, and they provide people with, and this is not shared, each person has it to themselves, and it's kind of like a self-awareness, strengths, weaknesses, what's bugging me at the moment, what would I change, how would I do it? And you never have to share that with anybody. You keep it to yourself, but then we have a discussion about it, and people come out and talk about the things that they could improve, or the things that would make them feel better, or things that, and it's an amazing exercise because it brings so much knowledge from the front, and it also is great for engagement. And then you can actually slide in little bits of training disguised as fun exercises rather than training in between the team building exercises, such as, did you know that this is how you do a strong password? Or can we simplify something? How do we make life easier for the customer, and all that kind of stuff?
Yeah, beautiful. So I'm hearing the word innovation sort of resonating here, that we need to innovate better ways of getting the behavioral change that I think we desire, but maybe training is not necessarily the go-to methodology, particularly for people that are fatigued. Now, I'm conscious of the time. We've got a couple more minutes, so we're going to wrap up in a minute. I'm going to invite each of the panelists, unless there's a quick question. Any quick burning questions? No, it's raining so much here, nothing would be burning at the moment. But let's go to each of the panelists with a quick takeout. What do you think? What's your one main takeout from tonight that you'd like to share with people before they leave? So we'll start with Lisa.
So I think from my perspective, it's coming back to, I know we're sort of talking about training, but I think it's about burdening overall, what we're through a range of factors of the fatigues coming from technology impeding their abilities to do their roles, processes, all the extra things that they're doing around the protection part. We need to kind of look at that and see that part. But I think, that training is a is an element of it, but I think it's all going to come back to changing our mindset, changing our perspective on how we engage our people, support them and train them. As we've heard multiple people have talked about, we're very big on that kind of learning part too, that it's not around tick boxes and traditional training. It's about changing people's mindset to motivate them to start doing things differently versus ticking a box and saying, I've done a course. You know, that's not going to make the difference. The motivation is.
Very good. Soren, I know you've just spoken, but any final takeouts for the audience?
Look, for me, it's all about trying to understand the person next to me. If I can do that, and if I can help them in any way, that's how you create a really good team culture where people are helping each other. And then any signs of fatigue you can deal with because you can see them earlier and you can pick them up earlier. And, you know, don't laugh. I have a 20-year-old daughter that's studying psychology and she's got me interested in it at the moment. So I'm certainly looking at that as a new tool that perhaps I could use in the future.
Definitely, Andrew. I think you've inspired us tonight. I'm going to leave you with the final word. What do you want to leave us with?
Well, very similar actually to what Lisa and Soren were saying. I think particularly if you've noticed that cybersecurity fatigue is an issue, I think it's super critical, and it sounds obvious, but it's super critical to work out where that's coming from. Because it's so easy for us to just think we'll train or we'll do this or we'll do that. But if we can actually just take the time to work out what the source of it is, that's hugely impactful. I think often it falls into two categories. We can either have it can be advice or action, we tend to say. So advice is, you know, people are sick of being told what to do, and action is people are sick of the things they have to do in their day-to-day job just to achieve security. And once you've had an understanding of that, well, then that will inform what you need to do to try to solve the issue a little bit. Because, yeah, sometimes it just won't be training.